Inviting me to take part in this amazing conference. I've been thinking a lot about it since the invitation came, in part because the writers gathered here, my father, Jonathan, Vincent, Joe Garland, Charles Olson, this is like the pantheon of the gods in my household when I was growing up. Charles, I didn't know, but there was a photograph of him on the wall at my father's house in Vine Street that my father always sat under. So quite often when we spoke to him, there was Charles kind of looming over his head. Of course, I grew up, trying to understand the Maximus poems and trying to understand projective verse. And it's interesting to me, I teach now undergraduates and graduate students, and projective verse in particular has really remained as an important text, particularly for younger poets today. The idea that it's not a strict form of poetry that forms the basis of kind of what poetry is. It's the mouth, it's the breath, it's the voice, it's something that comes from the body. And the idea that pages can be broken apart to better express how a poem is born inside of the writer. That's something. It's a very powerful idea to young writers, and it's great to be able to talk to my students about projective verse and about Olson, given his history in Gloucester. I'm going to try to keep this very brief. You have copies of A Walker in the City, a collection of my father's newspaper columns for the Gloucester Daily Times. We reprinted this year, and we didn't do a whole lot of work on it. The text was in very good shape, but it had gone out of print. There were no more copies left, and they were going for something like $500 on Amazon. And we thought, well, that's kind of ridiculous. We need to print some more. So we got together as a family, and we did, and that was so much fun. We've been looking through some of my father's other manuscripts, and we realized, we really need to publish his last novel, Nostalgia, which we just did, and celebrated its launch on last night. Okay, so I'm going to read a very brief essay called "The Last Walking Age," which I think is raises a lot of what this conference is about. Charles Olson was fond of reminding his friends that he came from the last walking age of man. Born before the First World War, the poet's generation relied almost entirely on their legs for getting around. Many owned cars, but they preferred running errands on foot or walking up to Stage Fork Park to take their air on hot summer nights in an era before aerobic walking became so popular. I remember my mother wheeling me up street in my stroller so she could shop at National Butcher's. The owner, Saul Block, would put the groceries right in the stroller with me. And when I could walk by myself, my mother would strap one of those children's harnesses on me. I've often wondered what the emotional effect was upon those of us growing up here who were led around on leashes during our earliest years, or secured like dogs in our yard so we wouldn't run away. Is that why it was so difficult for some of us ever to leave town? And were our mothers so afraid of losing us? I think the Second World War had a lot to do with people's fears. To this day, I dream of objects falling out of the sky on me, like German bombs which never came. But we were terrified of them just the same. Our fathers or uncles were overseas fighting fascism. Our mothers worked. The gasoline ration kept people from driving unless there was an emergency. So it was natural for people to walk more then. Before the automobile invaded our lives, there were residents of Lanesville or Bayview who thought nothing of walking to work in downtown Gloucester, just as those who lived on Portuguese Hill would go by foot to Gorton's and the other fish plants. Years later, I met a man who would walk daily from Riverdale across Dogtown to Rocky Neck, where he worked at the railways. My brother Tom and I walked twice a day to the hubby school from our house down by the Cup. Those were the days when everybody went home for lunch, even kids in elementary school. No one questioned the custom of walking everywhere, and I'm sure it had a salutary effect on us. I don't remember too many overweight kids in school. For some of us, the habit of walking stayed. I used to walk from the high school home to Rocky Neck whenever I missed the bus. Even if I was on Main Street, hanging out at Nick's pool room or drinking coffee with my friends at the Tic-Toc donut shop next to the waiting station, I preferred walking home rather than taking the bus, which my school pass would have allowed me to do for nothing. Beginning in 7th or 8th grade, Bob Stevenson and I started walking all over the island together. Aside from being good exercise, walking helped us to get know our home place better. Just look at Bob's paintings today. During the years when Bob and I were hiking, we'd often run into some older men who took a nature walk each Saturday afternoon. The group included Anasquam retirees Elliot Rogers, Melvin Copeland, and General James Cunningham, along with businessmen like Ben Kookaroo and naturalist John Kieran. Sometimes my father would sneak away from the store, this is his store Peters on Rocky Neck, to join them in the vigorous treks they made through the woods of Cape Ann. They called themselves the General James Cunningham Walking and Chowder Club. And once a year they actually gathered to eat chowder, often prepared by Helen Rogers, who was one of Cape Ann's finest cooks. I also liked walking by myself. On the homeward journey from Main Street to Rocky Neck, I'd think about essays I had to write for Miss Harris's English class. Ever since then, I've always found that walking helps me to work through what I'm trying to write. Being alone, I'd also brood about girls I was in love with, or I'd be looking around me at the wharves that teemed with activity at the head of the harbor along East Main Street. To this day, I retain vivid images from those walks, pictures that help me call up the seemingly endless flake racks and the white clapboards and dark green shutters of the city's houses as I knew them. Sometimes Olson cheated. Once Jonathan Bayliss caught him taking a cab up to Dogtown instead of walking from the fort. Olson's excuse was that he was in a hurry to check out a property he just discovered in the Registry of Deeds, but we knew that Dogtown wasn't going to disappear any more than we expected the city to change. Little did we realize what was in store for us. And that's the essay. That's from June 15th to 20th, 2002. So that's actually one of the later essays in the book. I don't want to go on for too long, but I think I've often thought about my father's walking, which was really kind of a neurotic, it was like a neurotically repeated habit he had. It was partially, for health and being outside, I'm sure to get out of the house too. But I think it was a real need he had to be in Gloucester. And that meant being in the landscape. It also meant being with the people. And it was often, when I was a kid, it was often very uncomfortable going on walks with him because he would slow down at people's houses and say, oh, this is where so-and-so lived in the 19th century, and then would get up on his things and peer in the windows. And so, and he would often go in the yard and go behind the house. And we would say, Dad, this is private property. Maybe, and he was like, private property. I don't think he really believed in private property, particularly when it came to his walks. And of course, there's a long tradition of that in England and elsewhere. The idea that for the walker, like the walker kind of owns the landscape, not in a commercial sense or a market sense, but it's the sense that if you've taken the trouble to leave your world and enter another place, then it's yours in a way, and it's there for your enjoyment. You get to be the invisible eye, you get to be like Emerson, walking on the Commons in Cambridge, be sort of the great transparent eyeball. So it's really wonderful that walking is the theme of this conference. I love the fact that these writers are all grouped together because they were in constant conversation with each other. My father didn't think of himself as a writer independent of any of the other writers who were part of this conference. I mean, I think he was constantly in conversation with them, both personally and then in their work. It's just wonderful to be a part of this.
Ben, thank you so much for those insights into your father. I feel compelled to share that when Sharon and I moved back to town, one of our favorite memories now from our early years back in town was to see Judy and Peter walking in the East Gloucester neighborhood on a regular, daily basis. They were, you could, and some days it felt like you could almost set your watch by when they were out and about. So, thank you. So I'm here to introduce Jonathan Bayliss. Of the 5 writers we are celebrating this weekend, Jonathan Bayliss is perhaps the least well-known. He did not have a high public profile as a writer during his lifetime. He was not the author of the most important work of postmodern poetry of the 20th century. He was not Gloucester's preeminent historian. He was not Gloucester's poet laureate. He did not work at Action or write regularly for the Gloucester Daily Times. If he were known around town at all, it was as someone who had an important job at Gordon's or who worked in the administration of Mayor Leo Alpert. But for those in the know, he was a brilliant writer of remarkable prose, 4 thick volumes before he was done, and a beloved fellow writer of Anastas, Ferrini, Garland, and Olson. Jonathan Bayliss was born in Arlington, Massachusetts, was raised primarily by his mother, and went to public schools in Cambridge and Arlington, Vermont. After benefiting from a scholarship to the Newton School in South Windham, he entered Harvard, where he studied for a year before serving in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He completed his degree at Berkeley in 1949. Jonathan and his wife Doris married in 1948 in California, where his 2 daughters were born. They moved east, first to Newton Center, then to Gloucester in 1956, where their son was born. Vincent Ferrini was among Bayliss's earliest friends here. With a background in sales and analysis, accounting controls, and management, he worked at Gorton's as the controller, where he developed integrated business applications for the IBM System 360. He also helped design and supervise the construction of the new Gorton's headquarters. A grant gave him 5 years of full-time writing. But he was such a strong supporter of civic engagement, he agreed to serve the city as assistant to the mayor and later as the city's treasurer. He retired a second time in 1985. Jonathan had begun writing in California, focusing on his Gilgamesh plays. His writer friends in Gloucester knew he was writing a big book, the early version of which he read from at a watershed reading in Magnolia in 1962, along with Ferrini and the young Peter Anastas, whom he met for the first time that night, and also with Charles Olson. The group adjourned to Olson's apartment down the fort, where they talked and drank till dawn, forming a network of fellow writers and friends that persisted for years. Bayliss began publishing his fictional tetralogy, Gloucester Man, with the publication of Gloucester Book in 1992, followed by Gloucester Tide, 1996, Prologos, 1999, and Gloucestermas, which was published posthumously. As described in the Bayliss Society notebook, and you've received a copy of this, from which much of this introduction comes, Bayliss' work is expansive, inventive, playful, and thought-provoking. It explores his wide-ranging interests, which include history, liturgy, tragedy, systems, nature, engineering, business, railroads, geography, and politics, as well as friendship, love, sex, domestic life, responsibility, and work. Jonathan Bayliss.
Hi, I'm Peter Littlefield. I'm going to basically read something by Peter Anastas about Vincent Ferrini. Vincent Ferrini was born in Saugus, Massachusetts on June 24, 1913. His parents, John and Rita, were Christian anarchists who emigrated from Italy to work in the shoe factories of Lynn. Vincent published his first volume of poetry, No Smoke, in 1940. He pursued his education in the Lynn Public Library. He worked as a teacher at the WPA and on the assembly line at General Electric. This is all from Wikipedia, this part. He married Margaret Duffy in 1942 and had 3 children. The family moved to Gloucester in 1948. He started a frame shop on East Main Street. In 1949, after reading one of his poems in a magazine, Charles Olson paid Ferrini a visit. Olson addressed his first Maximus poems as letters to Vincent. With Olson, Ferrini fought to preserve Gloucester's, quote, "the wildfire greed that will destroy the spirit and originality of this city," in countless editorials, letters to the editor, and city council speeches. Ferrini remained an academic outsider who kept publishing for over 67 years, producing 31 volumes of poetry, 4 volumes of plays, and an autobiography. He is the subject of his nephew Henry Ferrini's film, Poem in Action. He was unanimously elected Poet Laureate of Gloucester by the City Council in 1968 and died December 24th, 2007 at the age of 94. So that's Wikipedia. For the rest, I'm going to rely on passages from Peter Anastas' eulogy of his old friend, and I must say that in this weekend, for the different things that I've had to do, I've come back to Peter Anastas again and again, not just for his information, but for his feelings about these 5 writers. So I'm speaking in Peter's voice. For Vincent Ferrini, community was as real as his Italian immigrant family and as closely knit. He sought community at the public library, where he and his friends developed their own college curriculum while their high school classmates attended the universities. When he became a factory worker, he found community in the trade unions he helped organize and in the Communist Party, which, quoting Melville, he called his Yale College and his Harvard. He was also a supreme individualist. No dogma ever held Vincent long, except perhaps his core belief in life as the poem and the poem as life itself. His nephew Henry Ferrini's brilliant film, Poem in Action, which you can see on YouTube and which I recommend, portrays in stunning words and images the poverty he grew up with in Lynn's brickyards, the strikes and layoffs he wrote so dramatically about in his first book, No Smoke, his father's admonition that he was born into the wrong class to become a poet, and his plunge into the daily grind as a bench hand at General Electric in the midst of World War II. As soon as Vincent moved with his wife Margaret, daughters Sheila and Deirdre, and their son Owen to Gloucester in 1948, he found himself part of yet another community. Through the family of Captain Serio, his landlord at 3 Liberty Street, he gained entrance into the Italian fishing community. In 1949, Charles Olson paid Ferrini a fan visit after reading some poems of his in a magazine, beginning a long and fruitful and sometimes contentious friendship. Olson hadn't been published as a poet at the time. Vincent was. The Ferrinis became friends with many artists and writers, including Jonathan Bayliss, a novelist and playwright who worked as the controller at Gorton's. What attracted Ferrini to Gloucester, the closeness to the sea, the working class culture of wharves and fish processing plants, and the intimacy of Brace Cove, where Ferrini walked every morning, soon found its way into his poetry. In books like Sea Sprung, The Infinite People, and The House of Time, one found a new lyricism as exemplified in this poem, The Tiny Room. The factory is in a forgotten city. We dance to the warbler's chant and explore the sky. Take time apart with singing eyes, approach the magic world of sleep. When he opened his picture framing shop, the community came to him, not only to have its pictures frames often more beautiful than the pictures they contained, but to talk. Gloucester was a community of artistic, intellectual, and political ferment. There were the never-ending conversations with friends Charles Olson, Jonathan Bayliss, Garrett Lansing, Harry Martin, Jay McLaughlin, who I see right there, and Celia Eldridge in the rear of Vincent's frame shop, in Olson's kitchen at 28 Fort Square, or Bayliss's big house next to the cemetery on Washington Street. The flood of visitors to Gloucester to see Olson or Ferrini seemed unstoppable. Lawrence Ferlinghetti came, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Robert Duncan, Robert Creeley, Amiri Baraka, Diane DePrima, Ed Sanders, and filmmaker Stan Brakhage, to name a few. Younger writers like me could only marvel at the things that were said. Me being Peter Anastas. Vincent's many talks with his friend, writer and historian Joe Garland, who, like Ferrini, had been a union organizer, and his encounters with the realities of life in a blue-collar city, fluctuations in the fishing stocks, the depredations of urban renewal, the encroachment of development that would threaten the fishing industry or undermine the historic character of Gloucester, spurred Vincent to a new activism. Speaking at City Hall in favor of the 200-mile limit to protect American fisheries brought Vincent into contact with the Gloucester fishermen's wives, who were beginning their many years of advocacy. Vincent grasped the parallels between fishing and the shoe industry in Lynn. For him, the collapse of a community's economic lifeblood would mean the collapse of the vital community it sustained. His activism informed the major poem he was working on at the time, No Fish, which is a multi-volume poem, in which the political, the personal, the social, and the ecological become fused in the metaphor of knowing fish. As Ferrini wrote, the pitch is that only when we connect with the interior fishes are we discovering and extending life by the innate rules of earth, and thereby saving the self, the family, the city, and the planet, unquote. Vincent was all there, all of the time, from when I, Peter Anastas, first sought him out to the last letter I received from him 55 years later, in which he wrote, "We cannot live without the hope that drives our dreaming." And this is Peter again. This is Peter speaking. This is the poem first published in Four Winds that sent me to Vincent's frame shop in 1952, when I was 15 years old and out of sorts with the world and myself. This is the poem. I pass by day and night. No one has seen me. If you ever want to find me and know me, leave behind yourself and enter the caves of other people. There you will find me, who is yourself. Thank you, Peter.
Hi, I'm Sibley Fletcher, and I'd just like to say thanks to Ben Anastas for bringing out the idea of the walker as an all-seeing eye to whom all space is open. And mentioning the English, because my mother was English and she did the same thing when she took us for walks as kids. But we followed her, we were curious. Anyway, Joseph E. Garland, an insightful journalist and thought-provoking historical writer, devoted his talents to his hometown, Gloucester. It was the home of his ancestors, his summer home as a child, and his real home for the last 5 decades of his life. Joe Garland and his wife Helen were dear friends of my family, the Sibleys. So I speak from fondness, but he had his sharp edges. He was a contrarian Yankee in his way. Joe came from generations of doctors and was expected to follow the family tradition. But he was unhappy in pre-med at Harvard, flunking organic chemistry. So he left Harvard and volunteered as a foot soldier in the thick of World War II. He fought on battlefronts in Italy and France in an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon known as the Ironheads. Joe's last book, Unknown Soldiers, Reliving World War II in Europe, is a really vivid, gut-wrenching account of this. Wounded in an accident and invalided out of action, Joe was haunted by survivor guilt as his platoon went on fighting across Europe to the liberation of the concentration camp at Dachau. Decades later, with Helen's strong encouragement, the survivors of the Ironheads reunited at Joe's home in Gloucester, reaching some healing. During the war, an army buddy encouraged Joe to write to an adventurous girl he knew who used to join his friends in escapades, Helen Bryant. As wartime pen pals, Joe and Helen fell in love. When they finally met after the war, they were engaged within a few weeks. But Helen's father decided that a jobless college graduate fresh from the war was not a good risk for his daughter to marry yet. So, in umbrage at this slight, Joe broke off the engagement and took off for the West, getting a reporting job at the Minneapolis Tribune. A year later, he married an accomplished young woman of the area, Rebecca Choate, researcher in a lab at Mayo Clinic. They had 2 daughters and moved to Gloucester in the late 50s, fixing up a former home of Joe's ancestors at Eastern Point, named Black Bass after the reef lying offshore. Some of Joe's ancestors appear in the local geography, like Niles Pond, Niles Beach. In 1978, he began research on a book about the Ironheads. And Joe and Helen then met again. Their love rekindled, and within a year, their existing marriages had broken off, and Joe and Helen reunited for their lifetimes. And Helen's 4 children adopted Joe like a father. Like one of his heroes, Joe was a traitor to his class. As a journalist in the 50s, he became a union organizer for the American Newspaper Guild, which limited his employment opportunities in the field. So Joe turned to freelance writing. Drawn to the sea and those who make a living from it, Joe wrote stirring histories of Gloucester's maritime heritage, beginning with Lone Voyager, his biography of Howard Blackburn, the famed dory fisherman and transatlantic sailor. Among his related books are Down to the Sea, Gloucester on the Wind, The Bear of the Sea, Giant Joe Patillo, and Adventure, Queen of the Windjammers. And Joe not only wrote about the fishing, he and Helen helped to save a living part of it, rallying the community to welcome home and restore the schooner Adventure, last of the Gloucester's dory trawlers. Adventure continues to be active on Gloucester's waterfront, bringing to life the days of sail with schooner racing, educational programs, and sailing for the public. From the 1960s through the 90s, Joe wrote a column for the Gloucester Daily Times. Subjects range from local to global, humorous and controversial too. Joe's anti-war stance was not popular. This is Vietnam days. With his strongly expressed opinions and amusing observations, Joe became a well-known Gloucester character. His newspaper columns are collected in 2 nautically titled books, Beam Reach and Beating to Windward, which are on our auction. Bid them up, bid them up. Joe was deeply concerned about the well-being of Gloucester's fishing industry, especially in the dark days of the late 60s and early 70s, when foreign subsidized factory fleets were destroying New England's fish stocks. And Gloucester's fleet was aged and dwindling, unsupported. He wrote in a 1971 newspaper column, and I quote, "For years, my old pal, Captain Bill Sibley of the small dragger Peggy Bell, has fumed that the government is deliberately destroying the domestic ground fishing industry, and I've scoffed at his persecution complex. Then I saw an unnamed federal official quoted in the National Fisherman as stating with regard to foreign competition, 'We should buy our fish from other countries who have the means to supply the demand and write off our crummy New England system. Only the strong fisheries in the U.S. should be allowed to survive, like tuna, shrimp, and, to this point, lobstering. What will remain is the best.'" Joe goes on to say, "After generations of neglecting the fishermen in favor of the farmers and other economic groups, Washington tosses the starved remains to the wolves of overseas competition. And when Canada and Norway and Germany and Poland and Russia and Japan have about finished them off, some chubby chairwarmer has the unbelievable gall to look over his pile of sextuplet reports and coldly order the offending skeleton to be removed from his view." Pithy prose indeed. In his column, Joe engaged with another contemporary writer featured in this conference. In 1968, he chided Charles Olson for railing against the destruction of the Solomon Davis home, asserting that the Y would be more beneficial for our beloved city. Joe later regretted that in his tribute to Olson year after the poet's death, quoting some of Olson's correspondence with him. "Joe's roots in Gloucester go deep. Though born in Brookline, Mass., he spent most childhood summers at his grandparents' home at Riverview on the Anasquam River, learning to sail and to swim in the Anasquam's powerful tidal currents. Sailing small craft became a lifetime joy for Joe. He was so thrilled to be able to acquire and restore two of Howard Blackburn's sailboats, the Great Republic and the Cruising Club. The latter came to grief due to Joe's tardiness in hauling her out before the winter. A late October storm drove her upon the rocks of Joe's own shoreline, breaking her up, and Joe recounted the unsuccessful rescue attempt in one of his columns. Joe also turned his hand to writing a book, The Gloucester Guide, which you have in your swag bags. Not a typical tourist handbook. It's a quirky series of stories about the town's many neighborhoods with enough detail to locate yourself and accounts of their intriguing history. Like any good historian, Joe gives the reader a sense of the past coming alive, and his clear and lively writing brings us into the stories, so we come to share Garland's love of Gloucester and its motley crew of people.
Good morning, everyone. I am neither a Charles Olson scholar nor a Charles Olson expert. I come to Charles Olson with a background in the performing arts, and that is certainly going to color my interpretation of his life. Charles was born in 1910 and died in 1970. He was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and in high school showed the signs of a champion orator. He went on to become an English literature major at Wesleyan and did his master's thesis on Melville. Tough stuff. Charles was a giant of a man. He stood 6 feet 8 inches tall. I would be looking up to Charles Olson. And I think we would all agree that he has left giant footprints on the island of Gloucester. I'm going to come back to that. But I want to finish with sort of the facts about Charles Olson. He went to Harvard and sort of bucked tradition there and did not follow in his sort of the tenured track professor thing. He went into the American Studies department and never wrote his dissertation for that degree. Subsequently moved down to New York City. And living in New York, he worked for the ACLU, the Civil Liberties Union. And then worked on the presidential campaign for FDR. Apparently he was offered some cabinet posts there and turned those down. And not long after that, I think a real turning point in his life was working at the Black Mountain College in North Carolina. And if you're not familiar with Black Mountain, you should look it up. It's one of those places that, like moths to the flame, attracted the most talented people in all of the arts. It was a school where the arts were essential to its mission, where doing was how you learned, doing was how you taught. So imagine opening up the course roster and seeing Merce Cunningham and Buckminster Fuller and Charles Olson and on and on and on. Yeah, I could go there. Black Mountain closed in 1956, and Charles moved on. Did I mention he was born in Worcester, Massachusetts? So like the rest of our friends that we're speaking about today, he was a local guy. His father was a mail carrier. If you're not familiar with Charles Olson's work, again, you should check it out. His Maximus poems are his big oeuvre, and when you read about those poems, some people find them difficult to read, others find them too difficult, others are not sure how to interpret them. And as a performer, I look at his work in the time that he created it. So he was and is referred to as a modernist or postmodernist poet or artist. And it's important to understand that context and what modernism did to art and how we as spectators perceive and participate in art. And I think what modernism does and what Charles Olson did extremely well in his poetry was to challenge us to experience his work in many different ways, in any different ways. So read one of his poems once, come away from that, go, what the heck was that about? But go back and read it again. And when I say read it, try reading it out loud. That's how poetry needs to be experienced. And that goes back to what Ben Anastas was talking about, the breath. The breath is the life of the poem. So go back and read that poem a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time. And it will be different every single time. And its meaning will be different every single time. Its meaning is not necessarily going to be confined to your intellect. Its meaning could come from your gut. Its meaning could be defined by your emotional response to it. And all of that comes together to create that relationship between yourself, your emotional, intellectual state, and the artist. So, what I am going to ask you to do as you set off on foot today is to consider the quarries that you walk by, the footprints of these giants that we've discussed today. If you happen to go by some other structure, think of it as a bridge that connects these footprints or that allows you to walk in the steps of these giants. I'd like to finish with just a short Olson quote because I would have to. And it's this: I have had to learn the simplest things last, which made for difficulties. I stood estranged from that which was most familiar. Thank you and enjoy your day, enjoy your walk.